here. So we welcome them all to this debate, and now we call upon Robert Dunne to open the case for his side. Hear, hear.
As a former committee member of the LNH, the 158 session, I do have to say it's great to be back here. I think before we proceed with this debate, it's important to define from the outset what is meant by the term political correctness. So far, I see two competing definitions of the term which have arisen within the last 3 years. One which simply states that we should simply treat people with respect and not refer to them by insults or slurs. So, for example, Donald Trump insulting Megyn Kelly or a disabled reporter isn't being anti-political correctness. That's anti-political correctness gone mad, if such a term were to exist. Rest assured that this is not the kind of political correctness which we are debating right now. We are not saying that people should be nasty, rude, or insulting. The second definition is one which says that women and people of minority groups require special protection against information that could possibly offend them. This has taken the form of trigger warnings, no platforms, and plans to turn the entire university into a safe space. This is the kind of political correctness that our side of the House will be concerned with in tonight's debate. But even if you don't agree with this definition, you can't deny it as part of the overall phenomenon of political correctness which exists right now. When the National University of Students in the UK refuses to condemn IS, Islamic State, in fear of being Islamophobic, you know something has gone adrift. My first point is largely concerned with the subtle prejudice that this kind of political correctness has created. Trigger warnings, no platforming, and plans to turn the whole university into a safe space are actions that have taken place supposedly to protect women and minorities. However, they feed into what could ultimately be called the soft bigotry of low expectations. The implicit assumption behind all of these measures is that women and members of minority groups can't be treated in the same way as someone who is a white cis male. The implicit assumption here is that they are not capable of arguing and discussing controversial ideas because they are too weak, too emotional, too sensitive, and not intellectually capable of hearing ideas that may be distasteful. If women or other people of minority groups object to this kind of infantilization or want to rail against it, they are not allowed to do so by these newfound regulations, not yet. And many of them do, I should add. Their concerns and feelings are ignored by students who see it as their role to act on the behalf of a collective using their own prejudices as a guide. However, there are other unintended side effects of this new form of political correctness. It can often have the effects of marginalising the marginalised. If we are to talk about the feelings of minorities, we have to talk about what Majid Nawaz says are minorities within minorities. A prime example of a group who've been silenced by this new regime of political correctness are apostates of Islam and Islamic reformers who fight against Islamic extremism. Apostates of Islam have been no-platformed in multiple universities. Ayan Hershi Ali, a Somali woman born who faced genital mutilation and arranged marriage, was disinvited from Brandeis University and had an honorary degree rescinded, largely due to pressure from the Muslim Students Association, largely because they did not like what she had to say. Maryam Namazi, an apostate of Islam from Iran, another person who has called for reform in Islam, has been no-platformed for criticising aspects of Sharia law and Islamic teaching. She was no-platformed by the Students' Union in Warwick University because of this. Also, when she was heckled at Goldsmith University, instead of siding with the feminist Namazi, the Feminist Society sided with the hecklers, most of whom came from the Muslim Student Society. Acknowledging that these problems exist may not be in keeping with the terms of a Muslim safe space, or the feelings of students who want to be offended on behalf of Muslim groups. But both Islamic apostates and reformers are groups that have been marginalised as a result of this new form of political correctness. We now have a situation in which the vast majority of people in this room would probably have no problem condemning people like Breda O'Brien or John Waters. They may make no bones about saying that they're homophobes, yet they can't bring themselves to stand up against extremists who persecute women and LGBT people and who would meet every definition of the word fascist. In fact, in some instances, we now have a situation in which people resort to apologetics for Islamic extremism as a result of this new form of political correctness, such as in the case of Charlie Hebdo. The fact that even the students in the room who agree with me tonight are probably sitting on the edge of their seats because I stood up for people who are apostates of Islam and Islamic reformers is already a testament as to how far this has gone. Okay, I now have I now have time for a point of information, so if anyone wants to bring one forward, yeah.
So you were talking about the bigotry of low expectations. So when trans people and organisations for trans people say, hey, it would be easier for us to participate in campus discourse if you didn't invite people like Julian Greer who deny the fact that we exist, is it patronising them to listen to them?
But there's a crucial problem. But there's a very big problem with your speech. Not all trans people would agree with you. Maybe some trans people would want Jermaine Greer to go and to come in so that they could go and challenge her directly. Maybe some people would want to. No, thank you. I'll get you at the end. But maybe some people would want to debate with her. And because your argument cannot be applied to all trans people and also their views, so it fails in that respect. Okay, so the low bigotry of expectations was the first point of my speech. The second point of my speech is concerned with the fact that even if you agree with trigger warnings, turning the whole university into a safe space and no platforming, you can't say that you're in favour of free speech. So what does free speech mean? It means the freedom to say what you want without fear of coercion or aggression. No ifs, no buts. You can't say that you defend free speech for opinions that you like. Every authoritarian and totalitarian despot throughout history has been okay with the right to speak for views that they agree with. Unless you stand for the right to views that you despise, you can't say that you're in favour of it. I'll now make an appeal to those who disagree with me and what I've said. Even if you think that the new politically correct measures are good, just admit that it tramples on free speech. Just admit that you think that in some instances censoring speech is justified. But don't say that you're in favour of free speech if you don't stand for the opinions that you despise. But if you are against the motion because your concern is social justice, do remember this. Every social justice movement is a byproduct of railing against a politically correct status quo. Creating a conservative, censorious environment wherein certain ideas cannot be questioned will cripple social justice movements in the future. Creating a university where certain ideas are off limits means that certain ideas cannot be challenged. If you are serious about confronting racism, sexism, and discrimination, censorship is the worst way in order to stop this. Remember, bad ideas do not go away just because you don't want to listen. Universities are supposed to be places where ideas can be challenged. As John Stuart Mill once said, if our beliefs are not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, then that opinion will be held as a dead dogma and not a living truth. And already we are in a situation where liberty and egalitarianism are becoming dead dogmas, a point that I hope I can return to later on. Okay, so on this side of the house, we believe in free speech and in treating everyone as equals and in creating an environment wherein social justice movements can flourish. Thank you.
I'm going to show you that not only is political correctness not hindering free speech on campus, but that it furthers freedom of speech for those whose voices are already being silenced. In today's society, our conception to which the extent of which political correctness limits freedom of speech has been distorted such that it shrouds the reality of its purpose. Political correctness exists to guide us in how to be respectful towards individuals with diverse identity facets and creates welcoming space that enables everyone to speak their mind, not just for a select group of privileged individuals to be able to say whatever the fuck they like. Because believe it or not, freedom of speech of those individuals is not what's most at risk. My disapproval, or of anyone else's for that matter, does not stop them from being able to say whatever they want. It's those who are systematically silenced by their inability to access platforms, education, and status who are afforded to those who are most at risk. We think that free speech is not something that all individuals are born with and can then be taken away from them. The ability to make one's thoughts need and felt in a meaningful manner is a result of a number of factors gifted upon the individual due to the situation which they are born into in life. That is to say, your opinion is only perceived as being valid and meaningful if people think that you are someone who is worth listening to. We think that the hegemonic power structures that exist in society necessarily lend that worth to some and not to others. The proposition may try paint you a world in which angry feminists are hiding around every corner, ready to tape your mouth shut with their magical political correctness tape. But if you happen to be one of those white people who feel like they can casually say the N-word and it's immensely important to their freedom, the unfortunate thing is that I don't actually own any of that magic tape and I can't stop you. I mean, give you one example where it's been beneficial to intellectual discussion on campus to casually spew racial or homophobic slurs and jokes about women.
On that point.
I'll take a minute. In what way is being asked to avoid that really impeding your ability to express yourself and share your ideas? When is having to avoid that word really limited you? Because there's a lot of words out there, and yeah, free speech says take your pick, but seriously, all political correctness is trying to do is politely ask you to think, and we don't think that's an incredibly limiting request.
Yeah, our side of the house never never said that people should be going and should be using those terms. I mean, people should not be going and using them. In fact, we agree with you. But we do believe that they would have a right to do it because there may be certain contexts in which it might be useful to say it, such as in a history class, for example. But you cannot go and afford to go and to ban these things wholesale.
There's ways there's ways of referring to these words that are like, such as like the N-word, which doesn't so saying it, and you can use those kind of words without offending somebody. And your definition of free speech said both of your definitions were basically the same thing. It is about respecting people, and. Sorry. Words have a lot of power, and we need to be aware of that. It can be fantastic, and it's why we value our freedom of speech so much, because speech is power, but some words have more weight than others. As a bisexual woman, the word fag makes me feel sick to my stomach. It reminds me that some people don't value my speech, don't believe I deserve the same rights as they do, and don't even believe I deserve my life. That word is rooted in years of oppression of the LGBT community, and when I hear that word, never mind the intention behind it, fear comes with it, and the fear of speaking in those spaces, and I know that I'm not the only one who feels that way. In exchange for small limitations on freedom of speech, as certain privileged individuals, we can have a society where oppressed groups can feel comfortable exercising their freedom of speech and integrating into spaces in which they are a minority. Given that groups of people who generally protest about political correctness have already been privileged in accessing these spaces, we think that on aggregate it's more important to prioritise the safety of minority groups over the prize of those who were never under threat. And it's not just the obvious racial and homophobic slurs, but just thinking about who the butt of your joke is can make a huge difference to people's freedom of speech. Because hearing people joke about women not belonging in science makes a lot of women feel like they can't ask questions in their lectures because they need to prove they belong, prove they're actually smart, and prove everyone wrong. And that's incredibly alienating and limits a lot of women's freedom of speech in those spaces. When we make campus a place that feels safe for less privileged groups, people can speak with more freedom. But what about inviting controversial speakers to campus? I do not believe in banning anyone from speaking on campus because of their views. But, again, is it too much to ask that we think before we invite someone to our campus and give them a platform from which to influence others? Take, for example, Milo Yiannopoulos, who honoured us with his presence last year on campus, a man notorious for his love of women and tolerance towards minorities. Whilst he is completely entitled to his viewpoint, he isn't necessarily entitled to a platform. He can say whatever he wants, and that's fine, but did we have to give him a microphone? Did he spews Islamophobic comments? People presume he represents the LGBT community, yet he's actively homophobic towards lesbians. And let's not forget how he blames rape victims for their own assaults. But, as many of my friends told me, it's just a bit of a laugh, right? People aren't really going to take him seriously. But, is that the message we want to send rape victims? No, thank you. And the LGBT and Islamic community of UCD. That it's just a laugh. Because if you're in a position to laugh at it, think for a second about those who aren't. You're allowing a very charismatic person with harmful, hateful views to get up uncontested on a platform where he looks particularly powerful and allow him to spread these hateful views in a scenario that skews the power dynamic between him and those he speaks about hatefully even further. PTSD is a very real thing for rape survivors, and we think that standing over his access to a platform on campus exacerbates the severity of their alienation. When you reify their worst fears about what those around them might think about their assault. That doesn't make people feel safe and be able to speak with freedom. It just creates more fear around speaking in those groups when they know that other people on campus have been encouraged to think hateful thoughts about members of their demographic. But as I said, I don't want them banned. But if you must invite those kind of people to a campus to start a discussion, then a debate format or a discussion panel would be more appropriate because it entails a fair representation of both sides of the argument. A Q&A isn't a fair and level platform for the people where the people of the other side are not as well trained in public speaking and are afraid to speak. I mean, there was a Q&A at the end of Milo's speech, and the man who claimed to stand for free speech, who was threatened to shut down those lesbianic feminist bitches who stand up at the end of his speeches. I mean, who comfortably gets up and speaks after he's said that, and given that the majority of people are terrified of public speaking already? That's not free speech, it's free speech for the loud, bigoted, privileged few. Proud to oppose.
So, I find myself in a weird position of having to defend Milo Yiannopoulos, which is not a good position to be in, because he does say a lot of annoying, weird things, but he doesn't do it seriously. I'm talking directly at you this time, because I mean, he's doing it to ridicule you. He's not like actively promoting any form of actual hatred. He's ridiculing what I would call people trying their best to talk about ideas. That's why his Q&A was much more than his actual lecture. It was, I think, 2 or 3 times as long as his actual speech. So I'm just going to take this opportunity right now. Do you think it would not be a good thing for people to go to a Milo Yiannopoulos talk, for instance, and raise these issues with him and talk about them, rather than just assume that everything he says is beyond reproach, essentially, that he can't be critiqued?
On that point.
Her first.
As I said, it's not a fair and level platform, so he's on the podium. Studies that show that if we see a man with a microphone, we're more likely to agree and sort of sympathise with him. So he's on the platform, he's given his speech, he's been invited, so people sort of respect him. And you're just a sort of a random person who stands up at the end and sort of goes, oh no, you're wrong. And he's very trained in public speaking, he tells you to sit down, you look like shit. Nobody's like, it's not fair. Like maybe a discussion panel or something, but like that's, yeah.
Okay, so can I ask? Did you feel that you couldn't speak out to me because I'm at a podium? I'm a guy. I'm at a podium. Ah, okay. But so were they. But so were they. I think it's ridiculous to suggest that there isn't an active search for discourse here. If anyone is trying to destroy the discourse, it would be your side. I don't think.
On that point,
Sure.
there's a massive difference between discourse and ridiculing people, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
There's a massive difference between making a load of homophobic, racist, or sexist jokes and having an intellectual, informed discussion.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying and what you're believing are two completely different things, because you're saying, people at Milo can have a chat and they can have, their separate opinions and it's all la-di-da, but it's completely different when a person with a microphone, as they've said, can stand up and just bash people in minorities who might not necessarily have the way to defend themselves.
But they do. That was the most important thing I said. They do. I'm not trying to suggest that anyone is trying to take the rug out from under people and just bash them without giving them a chance. People are given a chance.
You said himself that he ridiculed people for fun.
Yeah.
You
No.
He literally said he ridicules
ideas for people. But anyway, I think, just generally speaking, it is ridiculous to suggest that anything that would stop anyone from bringing forward any kind of idea, regardless of how awful it is. Like, for instance, Holocaust deniers, I find them awful. But I think the facts are on my side with Holocaust deniers, so I don't see any way to, shut them down and not be dishonest in my belief. I think... Oh, God. Yeah. Please.
If someone believes in free speech, and you spoke on this debate last year, are you going to be a little bit careful by comparing feminists who don't want Milo with Holocaust deniers?
No, to clarify, that wasn't my intention. It was an accident. It's not my fault. No, I think the fact that Milo can go up and say something is comparable to how, not in practice, but comparable in principle to how people can come up and break norms that we've had in the past. Like, for instance, when we look at all of the great notions and ideas that drive our society now, once they were completely and utterly out of the question, completely politically incorrect. Female suffrage was considered, for instance, considered abnormal, unnatural, absurd, and in one instance that I found, offensive that a woman would even think that a man did not adequately represent her interests. We've moved on because we talked about it, because we weren't afraid to talk about it. Same with racial equality. If you look at, everyone talks about the great emancipator Lincoln, who often said many, many things about, just give me a sec, about how slavery was secondary to his agenda. In fact, if he could win the war and keep slavery as it is, he would. I think we've moved past these things. We've outgrown these things because we've talked about them. Bad ideas can't handle the light. They don't survive. If it's true, let us talk about it. Let us discuss it. I'll take your point now if you want.
Sorry, it doesn't. Never mind.
Also, like we live in Ireland, obviously, which is a nation of great religious persecution in our history. For instance, I just picked it on a list of like incidents, the massacre of Scullin and Oak, where people thought it would be a good idea to lock 100 Protestants in a barn and light it on fire just because they disagreed with you. I think that's contemptible. And I think we see this now. I think that's the insidious side, the more insidious side of political correctness that we see now. I don't think I'm overreaching when I say that the things behind political correctness actually kill now. For instance, I'm happy to provide examples. So, for instance, Charlie Hebdo was mentioned. Is that not an example? Give me a second. I know, I understand. But, it's hard for me too. Is that the bell? Okay. I'll just go with the Black Lives Matter example. In Charlotte, recently there was 2 shootings from which arose a Black Lives Matter protest and demonstration in Charlotte, which has since necessitated a state of emergency by the city board. And there was a case of this one guy. I've got a list of examples here, but I'll just stick with this one guy. His name is Ken, and he was a guy part of a Free Hugs project, which was basically a pacifist organization that tried to promote a peaceful resolution to issues of race. He was hugging a cop behind the demonstration, and as soon as he did it, everyone turned on him, just because he was standing up for a peaceful discussion, a peaceful resolution. And if you look at the things that have happened in Charlotte, there's been looting, a man was shot, there's been all sorts of vandalism, and it's provoked by the kind of ire that we see from people who rile up this kind of hatred at someone who they haven't even talked to. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's honest. I think it's counterproductive a lot of the time, because it's just making people insensitive to your point of view when it motivates people to shoot other people. Like, for instance, five people were shot dead in Dallas recently, and nine more policemen were wounded. These are things that are motivated by not listening to someone. And for that reason, I would beg you, with a cherry on top, please oppose this motion. Or promote. It's my contrarian personality. And by that, of course, I mean propose the motion. Thank you very much.
Now let's welcome Doireann O'Brien. Here.
Okay, so Georgia took a lot of my points, so I'm going to have a brief chat about safe spaces, what they actually are, trigger warnings, what they actually are. I'm going to firstly just say Obviously, we do not have to stand over burning people in a barn. Like, literally, no one thinks that's good, okay? We don't agree with that either. That's awful. We also don't agree with people apologizing for ISIS. That's awful, okay? That's not political correctness. That's just being crazy, okay? Right. Then, yeah, so just briefly then I'm gonna talk about trigger warning safe spaces, then just point out the actual ridiculousness of the last speech. I'm gonna extend briefly on what Georgia said. I'm really sorry. Okay, so firstly, what is a trigger warning? Oh my God, a trigger warning is absolutely just not an impeachment of free speech, okay? If I have read the last Game of Thrones book and I want to discuss it on Facebook, I would write a post being like, hey, blah, 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 this happens in the Game of Thrones book. Do you know what I do because I'm a sound person? At the top, I'd write, spoiler warning, Game of Thrones last book. Do you know what that does? It means that, no thank you, it means that people who don't want to have that spoiled don't have to look at it. They can just scroll past. They can be like, whoa, I'll save that for the next season whenever that comes out. No, but does it curtail my free speech? Absolutely not. I've still written that Facebook post. People are still able to engage with that Facebook post. If they don't want to, they don't have to because they don't want it to be spoiled. No, thank you. Trigger warnings, exactly the same thing. If you think that reading, a graphic description of a rape is going to bring back really bad memories of what is probably the most traumatic experience in your life, if you think that's going to happen, you don't have to do that, okay? And if you do want to read it, you can mentally prepare yourself. If you do want to read it, okay, maybe you decide that you do want to read it because, some people like reading things like that, okay? But if you do want to read it, you are able to mentally prepare yourself and put yourself in a space where you are capable of reading it, okay? Because if something like that comes out of the blue at you, it is an extremely shocking thing to have those memories just come back. Whereas if you're in the space where you know that you're going to be reading this, it is a lot easier for you to deal with that, okay? That is what a trigger warning does. It does not stop anyone from saying what they do. It just was saying what they want to. It just stops people from being harmed by that. No, thank you. Okay, safe spaces. Similarly, safe spaces are not just places where left-wing people are insulated from trickle-down economics. That's not what a safe space is. Okay, a safe space is somewhere where people who are typically are oppressed, okay, are able to go and just be by themselves. So for example, I know that some African American women find are under a big burden in society, because they have a lot of stereotypes thrown at them. They have a lot of expectations, so they have to act in certain ways, in the workplace and things like that, so that people will not be overtly racist to them. When they're in spaces where there's just African American women around them, they're able to just relax. They're able to just be themselves for once, okay? It doesn't mean that they're just, oh my God, I can't deal with the outside world. No, they have to deal with the outside world. That's shit, okay? But they're able to be themselves in this one space, and that's quite a nice thing for them to do. Okay, I'm going to move on to my actual point. So firstly, yeah, so basically, that is what political correctness is. It's just being sound, okay? It's just not being a dick, right? Both of the definitions that he gave were just that, okay? Right, so then what Proposition are really just doing is voicing their anxiety that they're no longer allowed to be an absolute trash person to people who aren't like them, okay? They're basically, when we call you out for being a dick to gay people, that's not eroding your free speech. That's me just saying the truth, okay? I'm just saying that you said something that wasn't okay, that I disagreed with. And you know what's very ironic about the Proposition, in fact, is that they want to stop me from being able to criticize you for that. They want to stop me from being able to say that it's not okay to say that a gay person doesn't deserve their own humanity, okay? That's quite ironic, isn't it? No, thank you. Okay, so then... Thanks. So yeah, then also, okay, the reason that political correctness is different from things like stopping, suffrage movements from saying things is because what political correctness is doing, as Georgia very eloquently described to you, is trying to get access to free speech and access to safety, which I'm going to be outlining more, for certain groups, okay? It's not like those women's rights movements and things like that. We're trying to get rights for women. We think that's good. We don't think they should be shut down. We think that when you're just trying to insult someone, yeah, we don't think that's the same thing. As in, me stopping Milo from saying that feminists are bad or whatever is not comparable to Milo saying the feminists are bad. Okay, so then, right, the audacity of the last speaker to suggest that political correctness kills people and that free speech does not is honestly just shocking, okay? Because as Georgia told you, right, when we exist, when there is a culture of like being a trash person, like a culture of no political correctness. What we have is people like Milo, I don't know how to say his second name, but him, going up, okay, and yeah, maybe he's joking. Guess what? Like, that doesn't matter. He's still promoting this sort of like discourse whereby whereby he's not respecting certain people's rights. He is taking away those people's humanity. No, thank you. He is saying that those people like don't deserve to be that those people don't deserve to be people. Okay, do you know what that does? It creates a culture where those people are not safe. Okay, because if, for example, if you make jokes about like women being raped, that creates a culture whereby rape isn't regarded as being as serious. Yeah, it's just a joke, but like in an overall culture, okay, that creates a less safe space for these people, but like a less physically safe space. Like this, the sort of space where we allow discourse where where we say that gay people are bad is the sort of space where gay people get assaulted, where people go and shoot up nightclubs in Florida. Like that is what the proposition is standing for. Okay. So yeah, so basically, free speech, on their side of the house, with no political correctness, does kill people. Okay, yeah, and then as Georgia said, it also like makes people feel unwelcome. It makes people feel it curtails the free speech of people like women, like LGBT community, like racial minorities, because they like if you are a woman who knows that you're not going to be taken seriously, why are you like? There's no point in you even telling Milo that you're not a feminazi. There's no point, and you know that he's not going to listen to you. You know he's not that he's going to ridicule you. You know that everyone else in the crowd is going to laugh at you. That takes away your right to free speech. How can you feel safe to like express those things? You can't. Okay, so basically, let's not be trash people. Let's oppose the motion.
Now we call upon Nathan who are young. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, and anyone who falls outside of that binary, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I'd like to thank you for the seriousness with which you've decided that the idea of a free and open debate is so important. You've bothered to actually show up. You haven't decided I might be hurt, my feelings might be touched, the other opinion might attack me, I shouldn't show up. So thank you for coming. Just on that, you're kind of already siding on our side. I want to restate that being on the proposition side of the House does not mean that you don't have a support for diversity. It doesn't mean that you necessarily think that the status quo with who gets to speak at the moment and how much they get to speak is perfect or good. In fact, there's lots of good reasons to increase the amount of diversity. Obviously, it's good just because it means there's fewer barriers to people of ethnic groups and gender minorities and so on. It also means that you get a more intellectually diverse base of speakers, guest speakers and debaters, because you'll have people from different backgrounds who can speak about different things. So yeah, all of this is well and good, and I support all of that. Political correctness, on the other hand, says that there's really just one main narrative it would like to speak about on most of these issues, which is something along the lines of, if you are from some sort of a minority, I am hurt, and it was cishet, white, neurotypical, able-bodied men who did it. And people who try to say, well, actually, this group isn't speaking for me, perhaps it was in the case of people like Ian Hersheli, it was men who would be oppressed in this country, but in their home countries have far too much power as people, we'd say people of colour, they're quite happy in their own countries to oppress women. Suddenly, speakers who say something along these lines say, or are told, you can't speak, you can't come to Brandeis, you can't come to other universities, you have no platform anymore, because despite the fact that you have everything we want, you're a woman, you're a person of colour, you speak about feminism, you speak about female genital mutilation, you might upset the hurt feelings of one of the groups we've decided is protected and therefore can't come. And just to be clear, what Ian Hersheli is doing is not trash talk, as it was called. She doesn't come forward and start spewing racist nonsense. She isn't Nick Griffin. She's coming forward and saying, there's a very serious crisis in the world that needs to be spoken about and dealt with, and a few people who might themselves not be politically correct in the regular world are Islamists are able to say we can get people on our side by claiming to be offended, and suddenly everyone will support them, and feminist groups will support them, and in many places in the US and in the UK now, the Students' Union will support them. It's a fantasy version of political correctness that says all you're really saying is just don't be a dick, we'd rather you didn't say use sort of racial slurs or whatever in public discourse, when the reality of it is, if we look at the UK, the National Union of Students LGBTQ+ officer is someone by the name of Fran Crowley. You wouldn't say that the head of the National Union of Students of the UK LGBTQ+ division is in some way a minority voice and not really worth speaking about. Yet they refused to speak at an event that was titled Re-Radicalising the Queers unless Peter Tatchell's name had been removed from the guest list. And the argument against Peter Tatchell was that he was supposedly racist and transphobic. When he said, this is untrue, I'd like you to provide any evidence for either of these accusations, none was really supplied. But other than the fact that he'd signed an open letter in favour of free speech. And the open letter he'd signed was in reference to cases of people like Germaine Greer and Julie Bindel being no-platformed. Now, he also said, I have offered my full support to trans rights, and I think it's very important this happens, but it's also very important that other people get to speak. And suddenly now he's also no-platformed. It's guilt by association. And this is being done by the National Union of Students in the UK. The idea that something like that couldn't possibly happen here and that the people on the other side of the house are just asking us to be a bit more polite and to have some good manners is, on the face of it, ridiculous. I am, as far as the definition of safe spaces, go ahead.
So I agree. It probably is a bit excessive that people like Morgan and Mazzi and Partiality are no platform. However, in the context where they have like literal columns in internationally syndicated newspapers to express their views, and the people who wouldn't otherwise be able to express their views because of fears of the process and similar lives, like why should we care so much about offering these people a platform in universities when they have other platforms?
Okay, well, we should be offering it because a university is the great link between academia and the ivory tower and the general population. We shouldn't say censorship is okay on... That argument essentially says censorship is okay on campus as long as they can speak somewhere else. Surely the point of a university should be first and foremost to say we're going to have a debate. On the topic of safe spaces, if I've helped organise safe spaces, I'm perfectly happy with the definition if the definition is within, in this area, these things cannot be said, or people who are not victims of this type of oppression shouldn't really be given a platform here. That's fine. That's a very much my house, my rules. I'm happy with it. Should continue. It's very important it continues. It's perfectly fair for a society to say if you're going to show up and be racist or homophobic or transphobic that they throw you out and don't allow you back in. But what's happening more and more is entire universities are claiming to have safe spaces, and this is why people like Germaine Greer, Peter Tatchell, Mariam Namazi are being disinvited. So there's a definition of safe space that you haven't addressed yet that is a very real one that really exists. Quickly, there's also a better option for dealing with the issues of people with bad ideas, and it is the one where you engage and expose. And we've heard, people from the other side of the house have said they would like to see a debate where the other side gets to speak. And in fairness to the Feminist Book Club, you did actually say you'd prefer to have a platform with Milo to put him down. But that's not what we see as the general trend of politically correct culture as it progresses. People openly opposed, for example, Nick Griffin going on Question Time in the UK. Before he went on, the BNP, the British Nationalist Party, rabid racists, had seats in the European Parliament. They had lots of council seats. They were not overly popular, but they had more influence than perhaps racist thugs should. Post him appearing and post him being on a panel with other serious educated people and being given a platform and provided with a microphone, his party ended up with a 0.2% of the overall vote. Compare this to Milo Yiannopoulos, who's been banned on Twitter and is now a martyr, and people can't get enough of him on places like InfoWars and Breitbart. You haven't stopped him speaking, you haven't gotten rid of his ideas. It's just the crazy people who like him even more and have decided to pick on this moment of weakness where he thinks he's beaten you and he thinks that you're cowards and don't have any arguments against him. Thank you.
Members of the House, there is a spectre haunting university campuses. The spectre of political correctness. All the powers of anti-progressivism have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Think tank and broadsheet, alt-right and centre-left, mediocre Blairite New Statesman columnist and jaded conservative news anchor. I realise that everyone will have come to this debate today with many preconceptions about free speech and political correctness. I hope to dispel some of these preconceptions today and ideally make some people think about the nature of their objections to political correctness and whether they are really quite as well grounded as they thought. My speech will discuss political correctness as an ideology, what it is, and why it doesn't create the echo chamber that the proposition would have you believe it does. But first, just a couple points of rebuttal. There's just a couple things that were just completely ridiculous that I have to point out. So we got from the first speaker essentially the idea that free speech means that you have the right to say whatever you want without restrictions. I'd like to point that out that literally no right ever works like this in a regular and an ordinarily functioning society. No, thank you. No right works like this. Every right is limitation because people have to live in coexistence with one another. That's not the way that works. Also, in response to the second speaker, the idea that bad ideas don't survive, so why do we still have fascism? Why do we still have slavery? I mean, that's just untrue. No, thank you. No, thank you. So, onto my main substantive, the ideology of political correctness. The main picture that has been painted of political correctness in the media is of a reversion, a new coat of paint on ugly old authoritarian limits on speech that these voices believed we had done away with for good. Another image is of students that are unable to think critically, that just want to live in comfortable echo chambers and that don't want to engage in challenging discussion about uncomfortable truths. I don't believe that either of these images are accurate, and at this point I'm going to tell you why that's the case. Contrary to these images, I believe that political correctness forms a valuable part of a critical and challenging progressive discourse carried out by activists, philosophers and politicians the world over. So firstly, political correctness is not a new phenomenon. The idea that originated back in the 20th century that we shouldn't call black people by the N-word and shouldn't call other minorities by their respective derogatory terms, that idea is political correctness. The decline in sexist advertisements, although there are still plenty out there, that portrayed women as subservient to men, that decline represents an increase in political correctness. The idea that we should enact anti-discriminatory hiring practices at work, that again is political correctness. Yeah, go on.
Political correctness was actually first used as a way of determining what is not acceptable to say in like dictatorships, as in what is likely to get you arrested. That was political correctness.
I am well aware of that. However, I am talking about the spirit of the ideology and not about the specific words that I am using.
Not what it actually is.
Safe spaces, a typical bogeyman of anti-political correctness folk, have been around for decades. Gay clubs are a form of safe space in which LGBTQ people could express themselves away from a repressive society, and still can. My laptop is messing up. No, thank you. Political correctness has contributed towards the improvement of a lot of people's lives because it has said no to racism, no to sexism, and no to these outmoded behaviours and ideologies. Thus, we have a lot to thank political correctness for historically, and I don't think anyone here would dispute that. But people say, political correctness back then was fine, but now it's gone too far. And if this represents your views on the matter, I'd encourage you to listen closely to this part of the speech. These people rarely describe exactly where the point was beyond which it ventured into the too far zone, but the point is clear. Political correctness today it's silly, it's absurd, it intrudes into the way people talk and think in unfair ways. To those people I ask, are the PC limitations on stereotypes about minorities today all that different from telling people not to say the N-word back then? Are the criticisms of Halloween costumes of Native Americans and Mexicans with sombreros really on a completely different level to when people used to tell others not to wear blackface? Are any of these things really that revolutionary compared to what came before? Or is it just that those who criticise the PC police today aren't comfortable with being told that things they grew up with thinking are okay are now not okay? They seem not to realise, I'll take you in a second, they seem not to realise that society does have to evolve and progress as new analysis on things like race and gender arise. I'll take you.
Yeah, back in the 1960s and back in the 1970s, civil rights movements and also movements that campaigned for the rights of African Americans were not seen as being politically correct. Even if you go back further, whenever there was a sexual revolution that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, that wasn't seen as being politically correct back then. So really, it has been pushing back against anti-political correctness, back against political correctness and conservatism that has brought us to this point today where people who are of minority groups do have a greater deal of rights than what they have right now.
All right. So on that point, I believe that political correctness as an ideology, as a practice, as all of these different things is fundamentally part of a, as I have said before, fundamentally part of a progressive tradition that seeks to strike back against kind of things that society says are okay. A lot of the things that politically correct doctrines say kind of try to espouse today are not in fact what are the kind of typical truths that we would accept in society, and therefore I don't really accept that point. So, when you realise this, essentially, that whether political correctness has gone too far or not is not actually an objective truth, but that it is basically down to the social norms you grew up with and how comfortable you are with those changing, it becomes clear that the real reactionaries here, the people who really need to open their eyes to reality, are not those who support political correctness, but those who oppose it. They don't want to think critically about their actions or words before they say them. They want things just to be as they always were, because that's where they feel most comfortable. That doesn't strike me as representing the openness of debate and challenging preconceived ideas that they claim to support. A side note on echo chambers. People who say political correctness just shuts people into an echo chamber where they don't have to hear any other arguments are unaware that they do so for the comfort of the echo chamber in their own head, where all opposing arguments have been scrubbed clean of any content and turned into ridiculous strawmans to rebut as they please. I went to the Milo Yiannopoulos event here in UCD, actually, since it's been discussed before. I listened to the Q&A, and it was literally just people asking Milo questions along the lines of, yeah, Milo, aren't those feminists crazy? Like, that's not a debate. That's literally the actual definition of an echo chamber. Like, this is not supportive of critical discourse. This is people who want the things that they think to be reaffirmed over and over again and do not want them to be challenged. The ideology of, no thank you. The ideology of political correctness forms part of an intellectual and activist tradition of challenging structures of power, of saying, you know what, this isn't okay, this isn't respectful, and it really harms people, so it needs to change. And if you are saying something racist or sexist and someone calls you out on it, they're not harming your free speech, they're criticizing your behavior, and simply putting your hands over your ears and yelling free speech at them isn't really productive. Some say that political correctness is just about whining and complaining. But it's good that people are complaining and agitating about all of these things now, because if they weren't before, it shows that that debate has got more nuanced and more complex and probably better serves the situation at hand. People talk an awful lot more about mental illness these days, but that doesn't mean that medical diagnosis has gone too far. It means that issues which were previously underappreciated have now come to the fore and are being discussed, which I think we can all agree is probably a good thing. So it's not about living in an echo chamber or shutting yourself down to opposing points of view for no reason. It's about challenging those opposing points of view, finding that there's something within them that fails in some way to serve the needs of the type of society we aspire to, and agitating against them. There isn't any shielding from opposing views going on here. It's saying, yes, we recognise that those views exist, but we think they are wrong, and proceeding from that point. This, in essence, is what political correctness is as an ideology, challenging and critiquing existing points of view, exposing their faults and fighting to change them, not hiding from any criticism whatsoever. So in closing, members of the House, political correctness isn't the spectre haunting universities that has been painted to be. Panic-stricken denunciations from such publications as The Spectator and opinion columns from across the political spectrum are representative of vested interests that don't want to have to change. Opponents of political correctness fail to recognise that its motivations come not from a desire to end debate and discourse, but from an increase in young people being critical of the way that we treat different groups in our society. I would encourage you, in the spirit of political correctness that I have outlined in this speech, the next time you see some flashy headline about political correctness having gone too far, to stop and think about why that person is saying that, and whether they're really as critical and objective as they would like you to think. Members of the House, I implore you today to vote yes to compassion, yes to change, no to that bell, and yes to challenging and criticising structures of power and replacing their outdated norms with genuine progressive values that are respectful of others. I am so proud to oppose this motion.
I believe that the culture of political correctness harms free speech. and you have assumed things about me based on that fact, right? Maybe you assumed it just there as I stood up and said that. Maybe you assumed it as I walked out and sat on the proposition bench, and maybe you assumed it about everybody, just as you did with the opposition speakers. And in a way, that's awfully strange. It's awfully strange that we tie this issue to so many other issues, to so many other platforms of certain political parties. And that makes this very frustrating for me sometimes, because I believe almost nothing with any strength. If we spoke, we would probably agree on some things and we would disagree on some things. I was trying to think, actually, as I was about to stand up, I was thinking, okay, what do I really believe strongly? And I could count two things, right? One of them is definitely that we talk about things very badly. The way that we discuss ideas in 2016 is just completely wrong. And I don't think it's quite true that the only reason that Milo has any followers at all is that we don't talk to him enough. But I do think that this notion of, these guys who don't agree with us, they're all like Milo, they're all bigots. There's this lack of any prioritization or discernment that often comes with safe spaces does polarize people. And when what happens is then when you polarize people like that, when you exclude that entire group of people and people who are associated with them, they're going to create their own echo chamber. We're going to get what the last speaker was talking about when Milo arrives, because they're going to say, well, these guys, fuck these guys. They don't listen to us. They think we're evil. And that separation of discussion means that all we get is these caricatures of each side. And then, what the last speaker was saying, about how the other side, our side, caricatures their side so much. Because that's all of the experience that we have of each other. And we listen to the other side talk and we say, look, that's not what we believe at all. Clearly they're completely crazy and haven't listened to the arguments, And I think that is a terrible thing. And that is how the middle in these discussions often gets excluded. That is how Mariam Namazi and Peter Tatchell get excluded. Does anybody know what Paul Ryan believes and how it's different from what Donald Trump believes? The idea that we can't have reasonable discussion anymore about those kinds of things, and able to see the people who are in between and able to see perhaps the grain of truth that where other people are coming from, really does greatly concern me. And that's why I think if you believe everything that they do, and if you follow all of the, the textbook, the list of rules of the ideology, of spectres haunting places and so on, that you should support us. Because you're not going to move the needle for those people, and you have to move the needle for those people because it's 52% of Britons, because it's almost half of Americans. You're going to have to move that somehow. And if you polarize discussion that much by ejecting them from your room of discussion and having them form their own echo chamber, you're not going to be able to do that. The majority of students in Trinity and UCD vote Fine Gael. In every poll that's done of it, the majority of students vote Fine Gael. But look, your needle might be moved as well. And I'm serious about this, by the way. Marxism offends me. It offends me when the last speaker opens... No, I'm genuine about this. When the last speaker says that a spectre haunts Europe and so on, there are a lot of people in the world who would be really offended by that, who are descended by the victims of communism, and there are millions of them who would be. But at the same time, maybe there are power structures in this society that we should pay attention to. Maybe poverty doesn't always have to be like it is. And maybe the needle can be moved a little bit. You see how, even though we are miles apart, we can, in this discussion, move our needles a small bit and see that there is perhaps a middle ground. You cannot do that when the other side is ejected into those echo chambers. When I react by saying that he must be placed in a box away from me, and that he must, he has to be on a panel. He can't speak by himself. We can't let him do that. God forbid, right? He needs 3 other speakers, and none of them be Marxists, and that's the only way that we can allow him here. I think that is a big problem. And I think that that's something which they need to solve. And I think that there are many reasons to do this. I think that is the especially compelling one. A few things about what they said. I do think that this is one pernicious thing that always comes up in this debate. Their side always tries to make it seem like there isn't actually too much of a difference in free speech between the prop and the op. They try to elide what they're doing, if that makes sense. So we get ideas like disapproval doesn't equal a free speech ban. Well, look. Sometimes it did sound like Milo didn't. They wanted to ban Milo from coming to UCD, and sometimes it didn't. But I do think that universities are an important place. In the United States, shopping malls, shopping malls are private areas and they have to be designated as public spaces, and you have to be able to march and gather in them. Because in many places in the United States, the shopping mall is the center of the town, and if you don't have that, then you have nowhere. I think for most of us, the university is the way that we access these ideas. And I don't think that you can just say, well, they have an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph and that's enough. Because for most people, in the world that we live in, that isn't enough, because most of us don't read the Daily Telegraph. We go to L&H debates. But also, even if you aren't banning Milo, I don't think it's just that. Like some things that some speakers said in this debate, and rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to make a judgment on it, some things that were intakes of breath. Now, if everyone in this room, when I say something, I'm a lot less likely to say that thing. And they argue this in a different way, which to do with power dynamics with certain races and so on, and minority groups. But there is a free speech harm happening there. And I don't think that necessarily, condemns them. I don't think we need to say they're evil for that. I don't think it's unreasonable that we debate and have a value judgment on that. But I think it is important, if we're going to have this debate, that we don't delude ourselves about it. That there is a positive difference between both of these sides, that on their side, people will not get to speak and ideas will not be heard that will on our side. I think that is a must. It is absolutely essential that we don't delude ourselves into thinking that that is not what is happening. So why did they want to do it? I'll deal with this kind of thing. They said that they're roughly what we got is that there's a corresponding free speech harm, which is that if Milo speaks, some people will not feel empowered to speak, and so it is kind of a one or the other thing. I think that is a false binary. One reason is that a university is a big place and an academic year is very long. We are not going to ban the event for women of colour at 3 p.m. in the Garrett Fitzgerald Chamber on a Thursday. We're not going to ban anything. You see how that works? You're out of time, but you see how that you are able to do both of those to a big extent, and I don't see how on a given moment that is quite as much of a zero-sum game as they wanted to believe. On the other hand, they do ban those people. They do prevent those ideas from coming forward and don't get to do the same thing as us. The last thing I'll say is that sometimes that's true and sometimes that's but it's not universally true. I don't think that these power dynamics are 100% determinative. Like, it may be true that when a man speaks at a microphone, we are more likely to believe them. I thought that the two women who spoke in this debate were the most convincing people in this debate, except maybe for me, right? And I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but I just mean that it's probably not true that everybody in this room believes that the 6 men in this debate are more convincing than the 2 women. It's a bit more complicated than that. And some people are going to speak out and talk to Milo Yiannopoulos. And since what's important, at least in terms of what we were arguing about, was the ideas that underlie those things and the ability to discuss those ideas, I think those ideas still get discussed on our side, but not on theirs. Look, this is one of the 2 things that I believe very strongly, and I believe it because I think that the kind of discussions that we have here can sometimes be completely wrong. And I think that the only way we can rectify those, and rectify those for both sides of this argument, is if we talk to each other. And we cannot talk to each other when we stop each other from speaking. Thank you very much.
So just to be clear, I agree with free speech in the sense that I don't think the state should ever actively attempt to censor free speech, except maybe in like the worst cases of hate speech. So in a sense, I agree with Rory. This debate is about the terms on which we have conversations rather than about active censorship. However, I do think political correctness is necessary for having the better conversations that Rory wants. I think the way we talk about things now is probably wrong. However, it was probably much, much worse before we had political correctness. And obviously we need to work on that. Obviously we need to change things. I do think political correctness is absolutely necessary for that. So to begin, I want to mention like an anniversary that occurred this week. This week was the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Cable Street in Britain. This was in London, where 80 years ago, Mosley's Union of Fascists attempted to have a march in London, obviously like in favour of fascism. The crowd for it was meant to be quite large. However, a coalition of Jewish people and trade unionists showed up and shut them down and stopped them from marching and prevented them from having free speech. The way like discourse is going to today, these people will be told that they are crazy social justice warriors who hate free speech and just want to like oppress everybody else, and that they're just as bad as the Nazis they're trying to stop from having speech. No, thank you. The point here is these are people who know those fascists, if they had a proper platform, their ability to speak would be massively limited. And this is the massive problem with most of the propositions so far. They try to pretend that there can be a free speech that doesn't involve any kind of trade-off whatsoever, that doesn't involve like some kind of speech being shut down. That is a fantasy. It does not exist. Because here's the thing, there's always going to be certain kinds of speech that shut down other kinds of speech, whether that be political correctness or whether that be the use of certain language like discouraging minorities and marginalized groups from speaking. They say that they want the most dangerous ideas possible being discussed in the same way that like feminism was regarded as taboo in the 19th century. However, they simultaneously say, oh, of course we're not in favor of the most abhorrent opinions being expressed. Of course we're not in favor of that, right? They try to have their cake and eat it in that regard. They have to accept that that will happen because they say they talk about two definitions of free speech as if so they say like, oh, one is just like people being bad people and the other is, you know, thinking like women can't deal with things for themselves or whatever. I found that quite confusing. However, they act as if one doesn't lead to the other, right? The reason why people don't use the N-word, the reason why people don't use sexist slurs is because like political correctness exists. At the point where political correctness wasn't there to do that, people will become much more emboldened to use that kind of language. People will become much more emboldened to use the N-word, people much more emboldened to use sexist slurs against women. Because here's the thing, like, what exactly has political correctness like done for us so far? Because it's important to consider it in its totality rather than just saying, oh, like there are some bad things that happen so that we don't like, so we think it's terrible. Like, I don't know if you guys realize, but like up until 20 or 30 years ago, in this chamber and in chambers like it across the country and across the world, like anytime women tried to speak in debates, they were constantly heckled, they were constantly told to get back in the kitchen, they're constantly like called sexist slurs. We have political correctness to thank for women being able to speak here. We have political correctness to thank for gay people being able to speak here without being heckled, right? They talk about the worst excesses of it. If they oppose political correctness, they have to oppose the other stuff too. They have to talk about it in totality. So that's really important. And here's the thing, like even if there are excesses, and like obviously I accept that like this stuff that happens to Maryam Namazi is quite bad. Some of the stuff that people talk about in American campuses is obviously like not the best. However, like it is difficult, right? It is a difficult situation, but like I think we should like defer to the people who don't have the ability to communicate their viewpoint, like in a national column, which is particularly important. But like lastly, on what political correctness has brought us, I just want to briefly touch on safe spaces and trigger warnings, because I do think to a large degree there are red herrings in this debate. But just to be clear, like to add a thing about safe spaces that is particularly important, right? Like you like. For just to pick an example, like I do a module on gender theory, right? And if somebody came into that module and like tried to interrupt us and being like, oh, sorry, I actually don't think sexism exists and I think men are oppressed, it would be impossible to develop like your theory any further, right? So for any kind of intellectual development, some kind of a safe space is necessary. But then, like I think the crucial thing to say here is, if we think free speech is important, which I think most people in this debate do, it's important to recognize that free speech is only free when everybody can actually participate in it. It's only free, like it's absolutely contingent upon people's ability to feel safe in saying things and to feel that they won't meet reprisal for saying those things. And the problem is that in a context, like in a campus that or like even in a university society that facilitates, and no, thank you, Rory, that facilitates people like Milo Yiannopoulos coming, that facilitates people like Germaine Greer coming. Like that is, it is very difficult for people who are oppressed by those people to actually to communicate that what they think, because they face active violence as a result of what those people say. Like trans people's lives are put in danger by Germaine Greer saying that trans women aren't women. It is disgusting to expect them to so the important thing here is, like, if you talk about free speech, it's about the ability to say things and to listen. Like, we cannot hear the opinions of people who feel in danger because of Germaine Greer if we do invite Germaine Greer to debates. Roy says, like, oh, it's fine because we don't ban the sort of like the hour where women of colour can meet up and get together. Insofar as, like, he says that university things that everybody goes to are like a necessary part of discourse, like if nobody else goes to those meetings, you don't get the benefits of hearing those people talk. You don't get the benefits of hearing those unbelievably, like those people who tend to be oppressed talk. These guys accuse us of like coming to the bigotry of low expectations. Look, obviously I accept there are trans people who feel who have the energy and the ability and the bravery to deal with that kind of stuff, but lots of them don't. Lots of people don't. Lots of like women don't have the bravery and the ability to deal with Milo Yiannopoulos. Lots of people of colour do not have the ability to deal with racist speaking. Those people get systematically shut out without political correctness moderating what those other people are saying. The people who get shut out as a result of political correctness, like, obviously, it's not the exact same, but typically they tend to have national columns that anybody can access. So I am perfectly happy to make that trade-off, because free speech cannot exist without any kind of trade-off. That's the trade-off I want to make. Thank you. Please oppose.